the Ontario Premier Doug Ford as he gets ready to meet with the province's Lieutenant Governor Edith Dumont, asking her to dissolve the legislature and triggering an early election. Let's take in the scene right now at Queen's Park. So there you have it, the Ontario Premier making his way to the Lieutenant Governor's office to meet with Edith Dumont, again asking her to dissolve the Ontario legislature, thereby triggering an early election. This meeting expected to last about 10-15 minutes time, after which Premier Ford will then hold a news conference, which we'll have for you live right here at CPAC. But as we wait for Premier Ford to emerge from that meeting, we want to talk about what is taking place here. And to help us do that, we're now joined by Robert Benzie, Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Sabrina Nanji, the author of the Queen's Park Observer newsletter. They're both in Toronto. Hello to both of you.
Hey, Michael.
Hey, Michael. Hey, Sabrina.
So here we have the great drama of Canadian politics. We see the Ontario Premier walking down the hallway to meet with the Lieutenant Governor. But, you know, as I said here, Rob, this is going to lead to an early election call. And by that, we mean a year and a half early for the Ontario Premier. For people outside the province, why is this happening right now?
Well, it's happening for a lot of reasons, Michael. Number one is Doug Ford's polling is really good, so he can win the election. They want to get out in front of the RCMP investigation into the Greenbelt land swap scandal. They'd like to get out in front of a federal election that Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives are expected to win, and they know that there's a tradition in Ontario that when people elect the Conservatives federally, they tend not to elect them provincially. They tend to go with the Liberals, and in one instance, the New Democrats. So there's those reasons, but then there's the reason that Mr. Ford is giving for having this election, and that's Donald Trump's 25% tariffs that take effect potentially this Saturday. Mr. Ford is very worried about what that'll do to the province's economy. He's talked about 500,000 jobs being lost. So he wants a fresh mandate, he says, so that he can, if he has to spend tens of billions of dollars on a stimulus package, he will be therefore justified. He said he'll have the permission of the people, even though he already has a majority government, and he had one at least until an hour, about 15 minutes from now. He had one until June 2026. So.
Yeah, June 2026. That's when he had until to call another election. But, you know, Sabrina, let's pick up on some of the points that Rob was making there, beginning with the argument that we are hearing from the Ontario Premier, because to hear it from Doug Ford, and he was signaling this even before today, as there's been wide speculation for months now that he would be triggering an early election. But that took a turn in the new year with the tariffs. You know, Doug Ford kind of putting himself out there as a Captain Canada, saying that he needs a fresh mandate, a large mandate, in order to take on Donald Trump and the tariff threats. What is being said about that reasoning, Sabrina?
Yeah, I mean, as Benzie pointed out, this is the rationale that Ford is giving the public, but this is something that, you know, he has refused to rule out since last May, obviously long before Trump came to power and was threatening tariffs. You know, if you ask the opposition parties, they're saying that this is just a complete self-serving move by the Premier to, you know, not only shore up his job, but also to outrun, you know, whatever the RCMP Greenbelt investigation is going to say. I do think that, you know, there are some vulnerabilities for the Premier here. He is riding high in the polls. You know, the NDP and the Liberals aren't even coming close to him right now, as Rob pointed out. But at the same time, you know, it's only going to be a matter of time. Once we start to see these tariffs come down, whatever that happens to look like, I think the public will be looking for someone to blame. And, you know, if Ford is sort of putting himself in that role as the steady hand, he could get some backlash for this. At the same time, I think it will also be difficult for the opposition critics to really run against him when he's, you know, making trips to Washington during this campaign and really, you know, going to bat for Ontario and Canada. That also makes it a little difficult for Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie to really criticize the Premier when he's out there with that Captain Canada cape. So there's a lot of themes that are emerging in this election, but, you know, pollsters are saying to us that the Trump tariffs aren't, that high on people's radar. They're more concerned with cost of living and housing. And I think for the opposition, it's going to be crucial for them to keep reminding people of, Ford's record on that, and really, I guess, take him to task and try to pull down some of those high polling numbers that we're seeing.
Yeah, well, although, the high polling numbers right now, and you've now both mentioned the RCMP investigation to the Greenbelt, and, had an election taken place around the height of that controversy, chances are Doug Ford would be facing a much tougher fight in this provincial campaign. But, for people who are not in Ontario, again, we're dealing with a national audience here, Rob. I'm going to ask you to rewind a bit. Walk us through that controversy, because ultimately this was about building on protected land.
Yeah, I mean, the Greenbelt is this 2 million acre swath of protected land around the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, and it's been around for about 20 something years now that Premier Dalton McGuinty created it. And when they did create it, there were always, it's not the Amazon rainforest, Michael. There are parts that you kind of look at and think, why is that protected land? It's right beside a highway, and there's a subdivision right across the street. So it's always been contentious to some of the landowners. And in November 2022, even though Premier Ford had assured voters that he wouldn't open up the Greenbelt, he felt that he needed to do that, and he opened up 7,400 acres of land that they claimed was ready to build on right away. Now, the problem is that the Auditor General and the Integrity Commissioner both found that those parcels of land were connected to, quote unquote, certain favored developers with connections to the Progressive Conservative Party. And so the optics were not great for the government, but he stuck to it. And it was only when his poll numbers, as you mentioned, Michael, they started to drop in August 2023 and September 2023. They dropped so far that the premier backed off of it and canceled it in September 2023. But the Mounties still swept in the following month, and their investigation is ongoing to this day. They've interviewed more than a dozen people around Mr. Ford. They haven't interviewed the premier yet, but he has insisted he has done nothing wrong, and he has told his aides, that current and former, that they must cooperate with the investigation, and they have been.
Yeah, absolutely, and without a doubt, the whole controversy around the Greenbelt in the second term of the Ford government has arguably been the low point for them when it comes to polling numbers. Yeah. But Sabrina, Rob mentions the RCMP investigation that is underway, and I guess the difficulty here is for both opposition and the governing party is that they don't really know when that investigation wraps up, when a report wraps up, and in a lot of ways, this is a control measure for the PC government of Ontario to try to get ahead of the issue, again, not knowing when the final report will drop. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, they're no longer controlling the narrative on this, and whatever the RCMP investigation, whatever comes out of that, obviously they don't know, and it's a wild card for them. I think. Definitely, even though the premier has backed off of that now, and has done this damage control, I think that it just sort of plays in, at least for the opposition critics. It's just more fodder for them. We keep hearing the same rhetoric from them, that Doug Ford is only in it for his buddies and his insiders, his pals. He's not really in it for the people, and so that, I think that's the theme we're going to be hearing from the opposition critics. That ties into the call for this election. Don't forget, in 1990, then Liberal Premier David Peterson pulled the trigger on a snap vote. It was a risk, and that ended up backfiring. We got our first and only NDP government with Bob Rae after that, and that's also not lost on the premier. So I think really it's going to come down to the justification for why we're going to the polls early when he's already got this whopping majority, and opposition critics have said that they're willing to support a stimulus package that to fight these tariffs.
And again, the Trump tariffs being his raison d'etre for triggering this early election. But Rob, I'm wondering what you've heard then from conservative strategists, because from what I'm hearing, my vantage point here in Ottawa is that they were pretty enthusiastic about calling the vote early. Have you heard anything contrary to that within the PC party?
No, most of the people around the premier are enthusiastic about going now, because they know the getting may not be this good again, Michael. Here's one thing that they worry about. Premier Ford has talked about the fear of these Trump tariffs, and it could cost 500,000 jobs in Ontario. Ontario's economy is very dependent upon trade. So let's say that the worst thing happens and we're in a trade war for a year with the United States, and factories in Windsor and in Oakville and in Alliston and in Oshawa are shuttered because they can't get the parts that they need from auto factories. That the industry is so integrated between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, specifically Ontario and Michigan and Mexico, that you could have tens of thousands of workers with nothing to do, and that's a recipe for disaster for any incumbent government. So do you want to be facing voters in June 2026 when there are a lot of unemployed people in Ontario? So if you're Mr. Ford, certainly not. He's very much more effective, I think, in good times. Although you could argue that during the pandemic he had to adjust, and I think that's when the guardrails of government kind of foisted themselves on Mr. Ford, and I think that's why he was rewarded with re-election in 2022, is because Ontario's performance during the COVID-19 pandemic was better than Quebec, better than Manitoba, better than New York, better than Michigan. But the idea that the prospect of all these unemployed people in Ontario because of these Trump tariffs, that scares the hell out of Mr. Ford.
Yeah, it scares him, as you say, creates his raison d'etre. But where does that leave the opposition, though? Because here we have Doug Ford doing well in the polls, his party doing well in the polls right now, and with both Marit Stiles of the NDP, the leader of the official opposition, and with Bonnie Crombie of the Liberals, both of them are relatively new leaders that arguably Ontarians don't know very well, Sabrina. So what type of challenge does that set up for each of them?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, Doug Ford is doing so well in the polls, and I think that part of that is not only because people are very happy with him. His approval rating is actually not doing so hot right now, but it also has to do with the fact that our opposition is relatively weak. They've had a hard time getting their message out there, getting it to stick. You mentioned their relatively new leaders, Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie. The polls suggest that people don't really know Marit Stiles, though those people that do know her tend to like her. It's just not enough of them know about her. And Bonnie Crombie is having to do damage control because she's been fighting a multi-million-dollar attack ad buy from the Conservatives that they've been rolling out for months. And so I think that that's also been hard for the opposition critics to contend with, and it's going to make it difficult during the campaign. I think people might be paying more attention now that we're in the thick of it. But I think it will be a struggle for them because they aren't anywhere close to raising the same amount of cash or being able to do the same kind of advertising that the Conservatives have really been doing. I also think that with the premier and looking back at 1990 with David Peterson, if you sort of take that example when he called the snap vote, the Conservatives at the time were just landing blow after blow with Peterson, and that sort of helped the NDP and Bob Rae, capture some of those alternative votes. And so I do think that it's going to be a struggle for the opposition. This snap vote is something we've been talking about for months, but all parties are scrambling to really get their ducks in a row. They don't even have no party has a full slate of candidates nominated quite yet. That could happen any day now, but it has been a bit of a scramble for them to really get themselves together before the big day.
Yeah, the big day, and I think, Rob, that's important to point out, because while the premier is right now meeting with the lieutenant governor, the writs actually will not be dropped until tomorrow, which means to say that really until tomorrow, when that happens, that's when the election truly begins, come Wednesday, not today on Tuesday.
Yeah, and that's why the premier is headed to Windsor, Ontario, tonight for an event to formally launch his campaign tomorrow against the backdrop of the Ambassador Bridge and the Detroit skyline, to sort of underscore to Ontarians that the frame of this election, in his view, is the Trump tariffs and the need to keep that border open and trade flowing. The opposition leaders, to what Sabrina was just saying, their challenge is to get people talking about other things, namely 2.5 million Ontarians don't have a family doctor. That is a huge potential political problem for Mr. Ford's government. We know from the polling that Abacus Data did for the Star that healthcare is the second or third top issue for most voters. Affordability is number one. Trump tariffs are actually quite low, relatively speaking, but that could be tied to jobs in the economy and affordability too. If we're in a trade war and American goods suddenly cost 25% more, I think everyone's going to be feeling the pinch.
Yeah, and I think Sabrina, that's also that raises for me an interesting question because when it comes to campaigns, oftentimes you begin with a set of expectations of what a campaign is going to be about, but you can never tell where it takes a turn. And as Rob says, you have over 2 million Ontarians right now without access to primary care, and Doug Ford has appointed Jane Philpott, Dr. Jane Philpott, former Liberal federal health minister, to bring about some type of solution. But that said, it could ultimately be a sleeper issue for this campaign because people do struggle to get health care in Ontario.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's something that Doug Ford, is going to have some explaining to do. He's been in power for 6 years. He's had this majority mandate, and meanwhile, we're hearing stories about over in Walkerton, people lining up in the cold, in the snow for hours just to have access to a family doctor. So I think, really, we're going to be hearing a lot of that from the opposition parties, and also housing too. I think is a major issue. Cost of living, healthcare, and housing is something we keep hearing about, and obviously, it's going to be up to the opposition critics to remind people of Ford's record on that. They have, housing starts have really tanked. They're nowhere near where they need to be for the Ford government to fulfill its ambitious goal to build housing. And if, Mart Stiles or Bonnie Crombie are standing in an empty lot during this campaign and say, Doug Ford promised there would be housing here, there's no housing here, I think that, that's a really big vulnerability for the premier.
Mm-hmm. And up against those concerns, housing, healthcare, there's also the fact that this government is issuing a $200 check to every Ontarian who filed taxes in I think 2023. Rob, I think that's the rationale behind that.
And their children who didn't file taxes, Michael. Yes, 15 million people. It's a $3 billion giveaway, and coincidentally, those checks are arriving in mailboxes right now.
So does that become a plus or a negative for this government? Because on the one hand, you are issuing these checks as the government of Ontario, but on the other hand, are some real public needs, healthcare, housing amongst them?
Well, certainly. I mean, the government announced on Monday, I guess it was, $1.8 billion toward primary care reform, to try to expedite the facilitating of doctors for all those 2.5 million families or people that don't have one. But then, they're giving away, a 1.2 billion more than that in one-time relief. $200 is, a lot of people will be happy to get that in the mail, but are they going to see it as a pre-election bribe? Sometimes these things can come back to bite you, Michael. It looks so nakedly obvious.
Yeah. Well, listen, and I appreciate the fact that two of you have been here helping us walk through as we're waiting for this meeting to wrap. I know, Rob, you have this other job that you have a deadline with. So before I say goodbye to both of you and we kind of move on here, I want to get some thoughts as to what you're going to be watching out for, because unlike many other jurisdictions in this country, Ontario has a clearly defined election period. Once the writs are dropped, we're talking about a 28-day election period, not too short, not too long. So what are you watching out for? Rob, I'll get you to start us off.
Well, between now and February 27th, what I'm going to be looking for, Michael, is Mr. Ford going to be cruising like he's a front runner and not taking any chances? What happens, for example, if Mr. Trump's tariffs don't come in on Saturday, as we all think they might? If that happens, then the whole rationale for the election is kind of is set aside. What if Trump says, "Yeah, I've reached a deal with Canada, there's no need for tariffs"? Well, then there was no need for an election. So at least if that's the rationale that Mr. Ford has chosen. So I'm going to be watching for that. And we're also going to be watching to see if Mr. Ford is the candidate that he was in 2022 when he pretty much won every single day, or is he going to be the candidate in 2018 when he had some rocky times on the campaign trail? He had some setbacks, and he was fortunate that his party won, but there were days that it looked like the NDP might actually win.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Sabrina, what are you watching out for?
Yeah, I think like Rob, I'm also going to be, paying close attention to this wild card with the situation in Washington and, how Doug Ford is going to roll with those punches and how the people are going to react to it. But, beyond that, I think I'm also going to be looking at the race for second place, at least for now, according to the polls between the Liberals and the NDP. There's a lot of battleground ridings between those two, and even the Conservatives and the NDP in a lot of areas, like in the 905 in the north and the Windsor area. And so I'm sort of looking in those regional battles. Will Bonnie Crombie and Marit Stiles be able to hang on to those seats, or even be competitive compared to what the Conservatives are doing?
As I say, 28-day campaign. Robert Benzie, Toronto Star, thank you to you, Sabrina Nanji. I'm going to ask you, actually, Sabrina, stay, because I know you got a bit more time. So thank you to the both of you for that. Sabrina, of course, with the Queen's Park Observer newsletter. Let's take one more look. Thank you, Robert. Let's take one more look now at what's happening in Queen's Park, because this is obviously the shot right now, a closed door, but what is happening behind has some great resonance and significance, because behind that closed door, of course, is a meeting that is taking place right now with the Ontario Premier and the Ontario Lieutenant Governor, as the Ontario Premier lays out his request, we believe, very strongly believe, to dissolve the Ontario Legislature, which would trigger an early vote in the province. And we've been tossing numbers around so much, worthwhile to bring into the program right now Eric Grenier, polls analyst, the man behind the writ. Eric, thank you for being here.
To be here.
So, you track all polls across the country, not just the federal polls. But when you look at the Ontario numbers, I think that's a good place to start, because we heard both Rob and Sabrina say, even if Doug Ford makes this argument that this is about creating a mandate around the Donald Trump tariffs, ultimately what has sparked this idea, and this was long before Donald Trump was even elected, was the fact that the Ontario Progressive Conservatives have such a commanding lead in the polls. Just how commanding is that?
Well, it actually depends on which poll you're looking at. If we look at some of the polls that have been published over the last little while, there is a little bit of disagreement of them. We have seen some polling from a few firms like Leger from Abacus Data just recently showing a massive lead for the PCs, 20 points, more than 20 points. You've seen some other polls, though, from Main Street and Liaison that show that the PC lead is not as wide. Now, I think that when you look at the behavior of Doug Ford, you look at the behavior of the opposition parties, that there is a bit of an expectation that that 20-plus point lead is probably closer to where things are. But definitely, even the worst polls for the PCs right now, they are still in a position to win and a majority government. And I think that the consensus among people who are watching where the polls are is that the PCs do have that very large lead, that 20 to 25 point lead over the Liberals, which, if it holds straight through to Election Day, would give them a bigger majority government than what they won in 2022. So based on where most of the polls have been for the last few months, that stronger mandate that Doug Ford is asking for, Ontarians seem ready to give it to him. But we'll have to wait and see if the numbers that we've seen will actually hold throughout the next 28 days.
Yeah, hold throughout the 28 days. But, again, 28 days in terms of a campaign is not particularly long. And in some ways, that really does benefit the incumbent. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the PCs really benefited from the extremely low turnout there was in the last election. Turnout in 2022 was just 43%. And I think that that is what the Ford PCs might be banking on again this time, that if people aren't too upset with the PC government, that they're not going to bother to go out and vote, which means if they're not going to go out to bother to vote for an opposition party, it is more or less a vote for the government that's already there. Yeah. So a winter campaign is also going to encourage lower turnout. Expectations may be that there will be a federal campaign that might follow weeks after the provincial campaign is over. Another factor that could lead to lower turnout. And in almost every single case, low turnout, always good for the incumbent government.
Yeah, and winter campaign here, 28 days will bring us to February the 27th would be the voting day in Ontario, second last day for this leap year. But it's a leap year? No, excuse me, I'm off. Excuse me on that. But anyway, still, regardless, the 27th February is what we're looking at. That said, again, there's this argument around the Trump tariffs, but so much of modern campaigns is about the leader. Mm-hmm. And you have in here Doug Ford, well known to the people of Ontario, Marit Stiles of the NDP, leader of the official opposition in Ontario, Bonnie Crombie, leader of the Ontario Liberals, arguably not as well known. What do the numbers say about leaders' impressions?
They do show that both Bonnie Crombie and Marit Stiles have a lot of work to do to become better known among Ontarians. I would say even the best of times, Andrew Horwath, who was the opposition leader for a long time, most Ontarians did not know who she was, even if she had been in that position for a decade. So Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie will have a big challenge to get better known. It is an opportunity for them, of course, because as more people get to know them, maybe they will like what they see. But what we've actually seen over the last little while from Doug Ford is very interesting and also indicative of why they'd want to go to an early campaign. If we look at the polls throughout 2024, Doug Ford is routinely one of the most unpopular premiers in the country, usually a 2-to-1 margin of people who dislike him or have a negative opinion of him versus a positive one. And since he's taken on this Captain Canada role over the last few weeks, his numbers have improved significantly. And most of the polls that we're seeing now show that a roughly even shares of Ontarians either approve or disapprove of the premier. And that is a huge improvement for Doug Ford. And we've seen that in the past. Going into 2022, seemed to be very unpopular based on the numbers, but during the course of the campaign, his numbers improved. He's already starting at a pretty good position, and I think that it does show that the angle he's taken on the Trump tariffs could work for him pretty well over the next few weeks.
Okay, so how big of an issue do you think the Trump factor will be in this campaign? You know, it does allow Doug Ford, and I'm thinking about the First Minister's meeting a couple weeks ago where he showed up with that baseball cap, "Canada is not for sale," which is quite frankly taken off for the company behind that baseball cap and that slogan. How much of the Trump tariffs is going to be a factor in this provincial campaign?
I think it has a chance to be the major ballot box issue, and it might actually be a bit of a preview of the federal campaign as well, how much of an issue it's going to end up being. We have seen polls, as was mentioned by Robert Benzie just earlier, showing that more Ontarians choose cost of living, health care, than Trump tariffs or relations with the United States as a top issue. But those things can be folded into cost of living. If tariffs increase the cost of living, they will become an issue of the campaign that are tied into that broader question of cost of living. So I think that regardless of whether Ontarians are thinking specifically about Donald Trump or just about how things are going with their bills and the cost of food and other items, I think that this will have a big impact on the campaign. That is what the Ford PCs are hoping for, in a way. Like, they don't, obviously would prefer there would be no tariffs, but they're hoping that this will be the issue that they can carry through to Election Day. But as was mentioned a couple times, you make plans and then voters laugh.
Yeah, make plans, voters laugh, and that brings up the 1990 example. David Peterson, you have to stretch back several decades here, but from the Ontario example, that was David Peterson trying to create a greater majority for him, and instead it came to the benefit of Ontario's first and only NDP government with Bob Rae. How are Ontarians feeling about this early call? Because even before Trump, I think there was a question of what would legitimate an early call other than being politically advantageous.
I think that what we've seen from some of the numbers is that Ontarians don't really like the idea of an early election. It's rare that you can get a poll where people want to go to the polls. But I do think that Doug Ford has inoculated himself a little bit. He was lacking a reason to go to the polls a few weeks ago. He now has a reason that is, if it's also politically advantageous for him, it is reasonable enough. It is plausible enough for a lot of voters, I think. So I don't think there will be that much of a blowback against Ford PCs. And we've often seen, actually, it is rare for conservative parties to be punished for going to the polls early. There does seem to be more of an issue for maybe Liberal NDP voters. So I do think that it probably won't be a big issue. And over the next few days, a lot of people are going to talk about the fact that this is an early election, but by voting day, I don't think it'll be a big issue.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's maybe we're circling back a little bit, but as I'm listening to you, I'm kind of wondering, where do you weight it? Is it issues of affordability? Is it Donald Trump? Or is it ultimately about the leader and the party? How do you weight that?
I've always felt, I'm a big believer, that elections are generally decided on leadership. Because we've seen from there's been lots of research in political science about this, that how people view a leader is usually the first thing they think about when they think about what they think about an issue. That if Doug Ford, and they like Doug Ford, and he says this on an issue, they're going to agree with him on that issue. So I do think leadership is going to be the main issue of this campaign, because it always is. I think in the end, people vote with their gut, whether you trust this person to lead the province or the country for the next 4 years. And on that score, I think Doug Ford has a big advantage over Bonnie Crombie and Marit Stiles. And as I've mentioned, his numbers have gotten better. So the position that he's taken on the Trump tariffs has helped him a lot. And if he can keep it up for the next 4 weeks, then he can probably count on another majority government.
Yeah, and arguably not great for the country, not great for Ontario. But if Trump makes good on the threat of a February 1st tariffs, it would feed into essentially the argument that we're hearing from Doug Ford as he calls this election.
It has that potential. It also has the potential to raise the question of was this the right time for an election? It is a bit of a gamble. It is a risk for Doug Ford and the PCs, but they seem to think that it's going to pay off for them.
Okay, polls analyst Eric Grenier, man behind the right. I'm going to ask you to stay there as we take one more look right now at Queen's Park. Again, the meeting is taking place right now with the Ontario Premier. That is not the Ontario Premier. That's a member of the press gallery at Queen's Park. Everyone keeping a close eye right now at the door behind him, as that is the offices of the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Edith Dumont, as she has a discussion right now with the Premier about dissolving the Ontario Legislature, which would trigger an early provincial campaign. And as we wait for Premier Ford to emerge from that meeting, again, we are expecting a news conference with him. It may not be the longest of news conference, as he does have a 3 p.m. Eastern phone call with his fellow premiers, the Council of the Federation, talking about the Trump tariffs. But again, as we wait for him to emerge from the meeting, let's now bring in a panel of Ontario strategists. Tim Hudak, a very familiar name for people in Ontario, led the Ontario Progressive Conservatives from 2009 to 2014. He's now partner at Council of Public Affairs. Kim Wright, a former Ontario NDP strategist, now principal at Wright Strategies, and Matthew Barnes, who snuck in beside Eric here in studio, principal at Navigator. He will be, we should point out, taking a senior role in the Ontario Liberal campaign, but right now currently not speaking for the party. Hello to the three of you.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, rather. Listen, Tim, I'm going to begin with you. Mr. Ford says he needs a new mandate to deal with Donald Trump's tariff threats. But does he really need one right now, considering his government holds a solid majority in the legislature and the opposition parties have signaled they're willing to work with the government when it comes to any impact on a trade tariff?
Yeah, he could carry on. But look, I like this. I like the way they're phrasing it, and I'll tell you why. Although, Michael, what are they talking about in there? I think actually Doug Ford jumped out the window. He's in the bus right now getting a head start on the rest of the things. Send a camera on the back. Look, the Premier has phrased it very well recently that he wants to have a mandate that is at least as long as Donald J. Trump. One thing we know about President Trump is his unpredictability. You don't know from one morning to the next what he's going to say on Truth Social or X, or how his views may change about Canada, Greenland, what have you. So if the ballot question for Premier Ford is, who do you want to have in the Premier seat during these tumultuous times to guide us through some rough roads ahead, it makes sense to have a mandate that matches a guy who's probably going to make those roads rough in Donald Trump.
Okay. Kim, what do you say to that?
Look, the Premier wants to talk about that, but look, Premier Ford is not going to be the one sitting across the table. Like, Donald Trump is not going to go meet with Doug directly. And maybe that's what Doug is hoping for, to have some Mar-a-Lago moment, but that's not what we're looking at here. And look, the Premier wants to talk about everything but the failures of the Ontario government. There are 2.5 million Ontarians that do not have a family doctor. Last week, we saw people lining up in the snow for hours for the hope of maybe getting access to a family doctor just outside of London, Ontario. So Doug wants to wear his hat, but let's get beyond the hats here, guys. Let's talk about the fact that there are encampments in municipality after municipality, large and small, across the province. These are things that are squarely at the feet and the failing of the Ontario government. And that's what the Premier doesn't want to talk about over the next 28 or so days. What I can tell you, that Marit Stiles and the New Democrats, regardless of the Premier's crass politics, wants to talk about these issues that matter to Ontarians and get some results. And what I know everyone likes to talk about polls, and we'll get to that in a lot. I'm a big sports fan, and I know Tim Hudak is too. It's one thing to talk about the regular season, and that's everything up to the writ drop. But now we're getting into the playoffs, and some teams that had all sorts of promise. Look at the Buffalo Bills, for example, didn't quite live up to the hype come the playoff season. And so that's what I'm looking for from Marit Stiles. She over the last couple of weeks had made an announcement that she's got a war chest of about $10.5 million from 220,000 Ontarians from across the province who have donated to her or behind her. That's arms and legs in a campaign, and I'm really excited about what that means.
Okay, Matt, what do you say to that? Because again, the rationale is the fact that Donald Trump, as early as this Saturday, may be imposing 25% tariffs on Canada, on Ontario, and Doug Ford wants to have a stronger mandate.
Yeah, I don't think his rationale holds water, right? He's going to the polls for a job he already had and was going to continue to have for another year and a half. There's not a lot of distance between, as I think you said, between the leaders on this issue, right? Between the Liberals, between the NDP, and between the Progressive Conservatives, everybody's in alignment. We see most of the premiers in the country in alignment that we need to take a strong, firm, coordinated response to Donald Trump. So Ford's excuse for going to the polls, there's not really a choice before the voters at the moment because everyone's fairly aligned. So I think we know what he wants to go into the election talking about, but I think it remains to be seen if that's what we actually talk about. There's a number of issues that Eric was discussing earlier are top of mind for voters in Ontario. Healthcare is a disaster, cost of living, housing. These are issues where I'll give him credit. Ford has been taking up the mantle of Captain Canada, so he has credit there, but he doesn't have credit on these key issues that Ontario families are dealing with. And I think if the campaign becomes about any of those issues, he may regret his choice.
Okay. Listen, I'm going to get the three of you to hold for 1 second. Let's take one more look at the Lieutenant Governor's door at Queen's Park. And this is in downtown Toronto, Queen's Park, the seat of the Ontario Legislature. And I apologize, the camera is bobbing around a bit on the ground there. But as we take a look there, the reason why I'm doing this is I'm wondering if and when the Premier will emerge from that door, as we now have a news release. This is from the office of the Premier, and it says the following. Premier Doug Ford today confirmed that the Honourable Edith Dumont, Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, has accepted the Premier's advice to sign a proclamation dissolving the 43rd Parliament of the Province of Ontario, effective as of 4 p.m. today. So there we have it. The meeting has resulted in the dissolution of the legislature. We are now, tomorrow is when the writs will be dropped, but we're now looking at an early election. Tim, we'll pick up the conversation now as we wait for the Ontario Premier to hold his news conference. Does Mr. Ford, listening to what both Matt and to what we heard from Kim, does Mr. Ford risk a public backlash for calling a vote so early?
Maybe, but I'm gonna doubt it. I'm still hurting from Kim's shot about my Buffalo Bills. I'm barely recovered in these last 24 hours. Kim, right, man. So I have a bit of a maxim that says the more you're talking process, the more you're losing. And we'll see if opposition parties talk about whether we should have an election or we shouldn't have an election, if that's worth their fire, or to focus on other things that my colleagues mentioned earlier on. Here's why, Michael, I think it's different than 1990. In 1990, David Peterson did what was a snap election, and there was no build up to it, no reason other than crass electioneering to get back when the parties were not suspecting it, or the media. The Ford government has really socialized this. Man, for about 6 months now, they've been talking about having an election campaign. Even today is unprecedented about talking to Lieutenant Governor ahead of time and dropping the red. And they've steadily built the case about why they need to have the timing now around having a strong leader when we're going through these very difficult times with respect to President Trump in a vacuum in Ottawa. The most recent history, Premier Houston in Nova Scotia, even Jean Chrétien against Stockwell Day, have been, if you set the ground and you talk about why you want the mandate, voters will then look at who should deserve the mandate as opposed to arguing about process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Although, the process aside, there are issues being raised by both Kim and Matt here, Tim, and I wonder whether you see those issues emerging, because you make the argument about Doug Ford, but, about Donald Trump, but the Donald Trump tariff threats did not exist until, mid-December, when Doug Ford has been talking about an early campaign as early as last summer. So do those other issues eclipse the need for a Donald Trump mandate? Because, again, he was talking about this long before Donald Trump was even elected U.S. president again.
Well, that's why I love election campaigns, Michael. We should have a daily CPAC hit to see if it emerges as healthcare or education, gridlock. There's no doubt that cost of living will be a major driver, and who has a plan to give relief to ordinary Ontarians who are struggling to make ends meet. But here's what would be the challenge. I've been that person. I've been the opposition leader trying to drive my message and contrast it with the sitting premier. There's going to be a challenge here because now we have the American scenario, and you try to get every stage that you can command when you're in opposition, but it's going to be narrow because so much is taking place in Washington, D.C. And the advantage of a premier, to use a backdrop of, as Kim said, maybe Mar-a-Lago, the White House, what have you. I don't remember in recent Ontario electoral history. That's what I'll be bold enough to say here in CPAC, that Premier Ford wins another majority government. That's not a prediction, Michael. That's a spoiler.
Okay, well, I'm going to bring actually Eric Grenier back into the conversation. You're calling it a spoiler, and I'm going to warn the control room ahead of time because this was not part of the plan. But let's call up where we do stand right now in terms of party standings, because across several polls, Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives are looking at a comfortable lead right now going into a 28-day campaign, not all that long.
Yeah, right. If the election were held today, I do think that the Ford PCs would win a majority government, and probably a pretty big one. North of 90 seats, I think, would be in the realm of possibility. The Liberals would almost certainly finish second based on what we've seen. We have seen some polls that show that they're getting a bit closer to the PCs, but whether that's actually going to hold once the campaign gets going, there could be some bleed over some of the federal leadership stuff into the Liberal numbers as well. And the NDP definitely has a challenge, but they have a concentration of support in their areas where they are popular, so they have a good chance of winning the official opposition again. But we've seen campaigns where things start out very good for a party, and by the end of it, not always as good. We've also seen campaigns where they coast and continue to lead, which was the case in 2022. Doug Ford started that campaign with a big lead. He ended it with a big lead. There wasn't really much that happened over the course of that campaign. This could be a different situation. There's lots of wild cards here, but I do think that Ford does have the strongest cards right now, at least at the beginning.
Okay, so Kim, what does that mean then for your party, for Marit Stiles, and the challenge that she needs to meet over the next 28 days? Not only if she hopes to be government, but hopes to continue to be leader of the official opposition.
Well, and Eric touched on it, that voter efficiency. I know when we look at these polls, these are province-wide polls, but when we start getting into these neighborhood by neighborhood regional battles, honestly, the province of Ontario could be broken up into 5 different sets of polling. We have seen over the last number of years these blue versus orange neighborhood by neighborhood ridings, Kitchener-Waterloo corridor down to Windsor, across Northern Ontario. We look at places that are even non-traditional New Democrat battlegrounds, like the last election, the New Democrats came in second in a place, Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke. Not exactly what you would traditionally think of as New Democrat areas, but this is also now an area that has an open seat because the longtime Conservative MPP has decided not to stand forth. So those 220,000 voters and donors that have donated to Marit Stiles' campaign and growing, those are those arms and legs across the province that as the campaign hits that playoff season I was talking about in earnest tomorrow, they're going to be looking at each of the leaders. What are they saying? What is the swagger, the energy that they're bringing to the campaign? Who are those candidates? And how does that work showing up? We've seen in the last couple of Ontario elections, the Liberals having some version of a mid-20s, upper 20s% polling, but finishing without official party status. That is both a lack of voter efficiency as well as some pretty sizable failings of their spokespeople and their leaders to really connect with voters. So those are the kinds of things that I would be looking for, and I think all of us will be looking for over the coming days and weeks. One of the things we saw just earlier today, Michael, which I thought was an interesting metaphor for the campaign, is these Doug bucks that the Premier and the Conservative Party had put out. This is the government rebates, these $200 checks that were supposed to land just at the same time as a writ drop. Well, those checks are bouncing in certain cases. So if that's not an election metaphor, that these campaign promises and these Doug Bucks checks aren't worth the paper they're printed on, I don't know what is. So we'll see how that plays out on the election campaign as well.
Okay, Matt, similar question to you, but in terms of Bonnie Crombie's challenge, because not only are there strong polling numbers right now, continue to be strong polling numbers for the Ontario PCs, but you have, of the 3 major leaders in the province, your party leader is the newest to the job, not very well known to Ontarians, and quite frankly, trying to build from 3rd place now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, one of the reasons that Doug Ford's probably been thinking about calling an election for 6 months, as Tim pointed out, is they're seeing the momentum in both opposition parties in terms of organization, in terms of getting name recognition. I mean, Bonnie Crombie's already been out to talk about issues that people care about, like getting people a family doctor or cutting their taxes or building more affordable homes. So if I'm seeing these come out, I think, the sooner the better. I can't that you don't want to see the polling numbers of the current government drop. So I think a lot of it's going to come down to name recognition. I was talking to, Eric was speaking earlier about how the opposition leaders aren't very well known. Mm-hmm. They are new to their positions. I think that's going to change a lot in the duration of election campaign. People in general are paying a lot more attention to politics at the moment because of Donald Trump, because of what's happening in the federal Liberal Party. So I think as Bonnie gets more name recognition, as more people get introduced to her and what her contrasts are on issues that actually matter to them, unlike a fictional reapplication for the same job, I think it'll begin to resonate, and the ground should shift quite a bit as people begin to be introduced to both opposition leaders.
Mm-hmm. Tim, I have to ask you, because the raison d'etre right now is Donald Trump. But the other part, the other reason for calling it early is there is right now an RCMP investigation taking place into the Ontario Greenbelt. Doug Ford supposedly, reportedly, very concerned about that, not surprisingly. How much of that is going to be an issue that haunts this campaign? Even if he wants the issue to be about Donald Trump, how will something like the Greenbelt affect this campaign, do you think?
It won't. If I were an opposition party, I don't think I'd put my fire on that. You're speculating. Maybe something comes out down the road, but there's nothing now. And my gut tells me that they had a bad process and rushed it. I'd be focused on education, be focused on healthcare, be focused on making sure that young family can actually afford a home to get their start in life. So I guess we'll see. I think that's all media inside talk. I don't believe that resonates with the average person. Look, I really enjoy watching this. I've known Bonnie Crombie, 20 plus years. Mara Stiles used to be a regular guest on a radio show. These are very effective communicators. They're energetic women. I think they're going to come across really well in the campaign. I do believe this will be a battle for second place, but I look forward to those two scoring off as well, because they have a lot of similar talents. So which one will break through?
Okay, you know what? I'm gonna. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Kim.
Michael, one other thing that's an interesting and I think entertaining factor for viewers is the yesterday Derek Sloan of the Ontario Party, which is kind of the right wing faction in Ontario politics, put out a video yesterday with Randy Hillier, both of them coming back and recruiting candidates, and will those candidates and those start to nip at the heels of some disenfranchised conservative voters on the right? And there's a lot of the who will show up on those cold, snowy days in February is also a factor. So those get out the vote, those knocks on doors, those putting up signs, those are going to be really interesting conversations. But the splits and the various conversations in riding by riding, community after community, are going to be fascinating.
Okay. I'm going to break the conversation for a moment here. And then, Tim, I'm going to reference you right now, because you're right. Maybe we should have kept a camera at the window, because apparently Premier Ford has left the office and will not be holding the news conference that we've been waiting for. You've called it. Tim Hudak calls it. We need a window cam next time. Or somewhere there must be like a bat pole where he escaped from the office itself. So listen, we're going to keep a very close eye on this campaign, obviously, because it's a 28-day campaign. It's very significant. What are you going to be watching out for? And I'll ask each of you here as we wrap this up, because unfortunately this is where we're going to be now. Tim Hudak, what will you be watching for in the next 28 days?
All right. So for the Liberal and New Democrat leaders, this is the first campaign for each of them. Again, great communicators, talented leaders on their own right. But I've been there, Michael. There ain't no stage like it. The brightness of that spotlight, the media around you. You are on equal footing during this campaign, but are you ready for that? One of the two will mess up. The other one will emerge. They fight for second place and then a potential government in 2029. For the Conservative side, will Doug Ford stick to message? What we see, as Robert Benzie said earlier on, the Doug Ford we saw in the 2022 campaign that was focused on a mission and they ran a campaign that made sense from day to day, or will they get distracted along the way? Final comment. I'm happy to be on with you here today. A lot of people are getting their message through social media. So what would the impact of the campaign that most of us don't see if you're simply watching mainstream media?
Yeah, well, to make a pitch for CPAC, we post everything on social media. Kim Wright, what are you watching out for?
Well, besides these clips on CPAC social media, and I'm excited about that. Look, there is always these moments of the unscripted, the candid conversation, and if I'm Team Ford, as they always are, they are very worried about unscripted Doug and what is he going to say? What are going to be those pushbacks that people have? If the Premier's looking for a mandate from Ontarians and spending most of his time not in Ontario, that's going to be a problem. These Doug Buck checks bouncing are problems. But ultimately, what I'm excited about will be how do those leaders all show up? What is that swagger? What is that energy? What are their solutions? Where is the authenticity? And those are the things that Ontarians are going to be looking for over the course of the next immediate couple of days and the longer term. And I will say there's a very big difference between political swagger and political hubris. And the Premier right now of calling an early campaign and spending most of it not here will be very much in the hubris category.
Matthew Barnes, what are you watching out for?
Yeah, I think there's two things that I'm looking for. One is, that cliche of the ballot box question. Doug Ford's been pretty blatant of what he expects it to be. I think it doesn't hold water, but ultimately, will Ontario voters believe that is the question on the ballot, is who's best to deal with Donald Trump, or will they view it as a referendum on the last 6 years of Doug Ford on issues that matter to them, like healthcare? On the second thing I'm looking for is, I think, what everyone's watching, which is Canada-US, right? Doug Ford's already made clear he intends to go down to Washington, as Kim was alluding to, in the middle of an election campaign and play Captain Canada. It could go two ways for him. Either he could double down on the success he's seen in the last month, taking up that role, or what happens if he goes down and is snubbed by Donald Trump, who he's been promising to get a meeting with for 5 months. So I think even his own narrative could shift a lot, and maybe that will impact the first thing I was watching for as well.
Okay, Eric, last word to you.
Just two things. One, on the opposition side, in the last election, the Liberals and the New Democrats nearly perfectly divided the vote. That was the anti-PC vote. So is that going to happen again, or will one of them break out, like Tim mentioned that they'll be trying to do? The other thing, we talked about the early election in 1990. You think about Jim Prentice in 2015, maybe even Justin Trudeau in 2021. One of the things that you have as a common thread between all three, they're early elections, and the governing party kind of phoned it in and ran a bad campaign. So will Doug Ford run a good campaign, a focused campaign, or take this for granted and find out that he might have made a mistake?
Okay, well, the 28-day period begins tomorrow when the writs are dropped. And Tim Hudak, I'm going to watch out for maybe a window cam based on your advice on future specials. So thank you for that. I'm Michael Serapio. A reminder to people at home, we have now received word that Ontario's Lieutenant Governor has accepted the Premier's advice to sign a proclamation dissolving the 43rd Parliament of the Province of Ontario, effective as of 4 p.m. Eastern today, which means the writs are dropped, and we will be covering a 28-day Ontario campaign. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We return you now to regular programming.